historical movement in the late 19th century as a reaction to both industrialization and the growth of large-scale French, British, and other empires throughout the world. And we're also going to talk about communism in an abstract way, as a philosophy. We're going to look at what the most prominent person in communism, the founder of Marxist philosophy, Karl Marx, what he, I wouldn't say founder, in that he was building on people who came before him, but kind of the quintessential thinker of the perspective, how he viewed history and why he thought the way he did. So, I'd like for you to take a minute, and also I should mention that the videos are in the description box. I will not be referencing them throughout this video. They're kind of meant to be watched either before or after the video. So take a look at those, but I won't be referencing them as I discuss. In the 19th century, if you look back at some of the pictures on industrialization, you'll see pictures of children working at spinning jennies, other devices, these giant looms, producing cloth. Children could lose fingers, even lose a hand. The labor conditions were fairly grueling, and the environments were very bleak. Now, one thing that we have to keep in mind as we look back to these conditions in these early factories, and this is something that is lost on a lot of modern people, particularly those who tend towards kind of a leftist economic model, and that is that in these factories people are working 10, 12, 14-hour days. And so you look at that and you think, well, that's horrible. And the 40-hour work week was something that was gained as part of labor movements that share in some ways some similarities with the thinking of these early communists. And of course, not entirely, and I'm not saying that labor unions are necessarily in and of themselves communist, of course not. But when we look at these very early conditions and the brutality that we can observe there, we have to keep in mind that the people who were coming to these cities to work in these factories, they were coming out of the countryside where they had done kind of back-breaking work. The hours, the physical nature of the work wasn't necessarily something that was completely new. But what was new was being in these confined spaces, breathing in toxins. If you're harvesting grain, you're out there in the elements, and of course, if you've ever done any kind of farm work, you know that there's a level of peace to that. For me, even though building a fence or a barbed wire fence, that can be pretty taxing, especially if you're lazy like me. And when I was a kid and wanted to go in and play Nintendo when I was at my papa's cattle farm. But even with that being the case, when you're out in the elements, it's fresh air, it's physically healthful in the sense that if you notice when you deal with a lot of people who've grown up doing farm work, that they tend to be kind of stocky and strong physically, from tossing around bales of hay and etc. But inside the factory, the environment is different. You're exposed to all kinds of toxic substances in some instances, unnatural lighting conditions. The work is very monotonous. So there was something to be said for these workers working in very poor conditions, even though they were used to hours and to back-breaking work. The nature of the work had changed somewhat. And on top of that, there was very little protection in some of these urban environments. For example, if a child lost a hand, if a hand had been mangled, or something had happened in doing farm work, the child who had been wounded there's something to be said, definitely, for looking at the negatives in terms of industrialization. Even though, in generally speaking, the quality of life for the average person rose tremendously after industrialization. That's why industrialization occurred. That's why it advanced unchecked. But with that said, when we look at these workers in the 19th century who have who experienced a great amount of hardships, a great amount of marginalization due to their being industrial workers. Contrast that with these pictures here of this Chinese woman who is a tractor mechanic, and these Russian men here who are working in a steel mill. There's an emphasis on dignity, there's an emphasis on the power of the worker, there's an emphasis on unity, on singularity of purpose. And of course, especially in this image on the right, there is an attempt to portray this tractor mechanic as living a very fulfilled, kind of self-actualized life, even though that term's not one I like very much. That's what came to mind. So that's what communism attempted to bring into the world, and it's what communists today still attempt to bring into the world. This idea that through radical revolutionary change, we can reach this state in which those who work in productive enterprises will no longer be alienated from their labor, like we talked about last week. Will benefit from the profits of their labor and will enjoy a certain dignity in their labor. That was what was in the mind of Karl Marx. When we look at Karl Marx, we have to, as a person, because he is such a profound thinker and so important historically, we have to think about his personality and how that affected what he wrote. Karl Marx was a scholar and a journalist. In the 1840s, he began to publish works advocating the redistribution of the means of production. And we'll talk about this term, the means of production, later on. He advocated basically how goods are produced, the machinery, the knowledge, the facilities. He advocated redistributing all of that to the general population. So, in other words, the average peasant couldn't afford to build a spinning jenny, so that peasant had to move to a city and work in a factory. Karl Marx wanted the ownership of that spinning jenny that produced cloth. He wanted that to be shared equally by the entire society. And for Karl Marx, the mechanism by which the entire society would enjoy ownership of this industrial equipment was the state. The state has to have ownership of the means of production. So if the state takes over the ownership of the means of production, the state being an institution rather than an individual, the state will see to it that there's equal access, equal redistribution, so that the vast majority of the members of society benefit from this redistribution. In 1848, he wrote a document called the Communist Manifesto, in which he outlined the path to communist revolution. And we're going to talk about a little bit more about how history was used in the Communist Manifesto to try and understand this ideology and why, what Karl Marx was really saying. And of course, one thing that we have to keep in mind about Karl Marx versus everyone who has come after him of historical note, well, not everyone, but certainly the vast majority of those who have come to political power under a Marxist ideology, is that Karl Marx was not a realist in any sense. He did not he did not have a cynical bone in his body. He was very much an optimist. He was very much someone who he personally believed that if you recall, when we look to the Enlightenment, you had Thomas Hobbes, who believed that life was brutish and that human beings were inherently evil, and thus we need a strong government to protect humanity. And then you have Rousseau, who argued that human beings were essentially good, and thus the government had to be weak to avoid corrupting human beings who are naturally moral. We get a very unique interpretation of Rousseau with Karl Marx. Unlike the founding fathers of the American Revolution, who believed that human nature is more or less moral, in a sense, so that human beings are entitled to protection from the state. Human beings are entitled to a level of individual control over their own destinies. Karl Marx believed that human beings were inherently good. And because human beings were inherently good, institutions would be inherently good. That giving all of this power to the state, that no harm could come from this, that this is the ultimate goal of humanity, that by giving the power to the state, that would be the best way to see to the needs of the vast majority of the people. So he's very much an optimist and an idealist. And you have to keep in mind that he's walking around cities in Europe in which there are children missing fingers from machinery. There are people working, there are people getting hurt, there are people getting sick, and there's no kind of social safety net at all. There are millions of peasants crowding European cities. They have kind of rural cultural values. They don't, for example, I'll give an example of this. In China, there are problems, particularly in cities, between city people and country people. If you lived out in the country, I don't want to offend you because I'm talking about myself here. Coming to St. Louis, it was like another world. Living out in the middle of nowhere, and then suddenly I'm in this giant city. But in China, there's a problem in that people are living. It's much more extreme than in the United States. The laws are totally. The situation is totally different. There are millions of people who come from rural villages in China who don't have access to public restrooms. So these public restrooms are something new. So etiquette in terms of how to use these facilities is something that is alien in the countryside, like with my papa spitting tobacco everywhere while he was out there. He had these old clotheslines that he would use to grow grapes, and unlike in Missouri, in Illinois, the grapes in Mississippi it's much warmer climate. It's considerably warmer, so the grapes were very small. They're much smaller. They're much more tart. They're kind of sour, like eating a warhead, like a piece of candy almost, but not that extreme. But you get the idea. And so they were very unique. And he's one of the few farmers out there who grew grapes, but they were always really tasty and really unique. So I always loved them. But while he would maintain these vines, he would spit tobacco. And he was outside. What did it matter? I mean, it might hit one of the couple little feist dogs running around, but in China, modern China, in cities, you have all these rural people spitting. Some of them are spitting just their spit. Some of them are spitting betel nut, which is something that's chewed like tobacco in China, and it's a taboo to many people in urban areas, especially well-to-do people and people who consider themselves to be cultured. So Marx was walking around a Western European cultural context in which you have all these peasants crowded into these cities, these huge slums developed. There was massive inequality, and people were suffering from injuries in the workplace, etc. And of course, being, from my perspective, extremely naive, he sought to explain these circumstances and to put an end to them, to actually create a better and more equitable world. That's what he thought he was bringing into existence. And of course, if you look at this picture here, you can see how he's got his hand in his jacket, a la Napoleon, if you interesting picture. It's a Chinese communist poster with Karl Marx in kind of blue ghost form, Obi-Wan Kenobi, kind of looking out over the rioters of the Paris Commune as they seceded from the French government and attempted to establish a commune, a kind of Marxist socialist state inside the city of Paris. Karl Marx and those who came after him considered their beliefs to be based on hard scientific truth. And that's something that if you've heard the term cultural Marxism or cultural Marxists, these cultural Marxists that exist today in academia and in some other institutions, people who hold to Marxism yet have what we call a postmodern perspective, where they believe that all morality is relative, they believe that there's no objective truth, that everything is socially constructed, that culture is what determines how we think, our standards of behavior, standards of beauty, our economic models. These people are not the same as the Marxists of the 19th and 20th century. Karl Marx and those who came directly after him believed very much in the idea of science as the arbiter of all truth. It was scientism, right? Marx believed that what he came up with in Das Kapital and other works, that he was explaining laws of nature. Right? Remember this idea of natural law? Just as when the founding fathers of the American Republic, all men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Right? That they were invoking natural law. They were invoking something that existed in nature. It wasn't something that they wanted to be true or something that they were creating. It was something that was there. And it's the same kind of thing with Karl Marx and his principles. When he starts talking about economic laws, he believes that these are objective laws that exist at all times that all people go through. So he argued that his form of Marxism, of communism, his philosophy, that it was a science, that it was kind of an economic science. And that's very different from people who tend to be called cultural Marxists, or who have a cultural Marxist mentality, in that they believe in the end goals, redistribution of the means of production to a certain extent, and they believe in some other aspects of Marxist theory, but they don't believe in objective truth. They don't believe in the ability of science to understand objective truth. As postmodernism and Marxism, original Marxism, are actually as incompatible as, say, Christianity and postmodernism. Christianity is based on objective truth. Postmodernism is based on the idea of subjective truth and of constructionism. It's the same kind of thing with Marxism. Marxism is based on objective truth. This is the age in the 19th century. People are making all these scientific discoveries. There are all these inventions. Technology is developing at a rapid pace. Life is getting better for many people by objective standards. And so Marx was very much part of this century of science is the way forward. So that makes him very different from a lot of people today who might identify as Marxists, but who actually have very contradictory beliefs. But we'll get to more to that in a moment. Marx rejected religion. He believed that religion was something that was used to, and again, a cultural Marxist will look at religion as a way to kind of prevent people from living freely. For Marx, religion was a little bit different, in that religion was something that was used to encourage the poor to accept their lot. He called religion the opiate of the masses. And of course, he wasn't attempting to be completely derogatory. In fact, this term opiate, while it means something, it means something very different then than now. Many people were using opium in Marxist circles and in intellectual circles in the 19th century. But basically, Marx was stating that, if you're a poor person, again, very small cattle farm. Because when his father was a sharecropper, um, then he had been in World War II, had been in the infantry, and had seen all these horrible events unfold. He had participated in a kill or be killed contest for 2 years in Europe, but and that to come back to a farm in northeast Mississippi and break his back out in the hot sun with no air conditioning, right? That's pretty intense. Uh, and of course, his wife, my grandmother, like so many there, was extremely religious, Pentecostal, very speaking in tongues, prophesying, etc. And from Marx's point of view, that religious culture emerged to allow people to cope, right? Their work, the conditions they're living in are horrible, so they will turn to hope in the next life, right? They will turn to God and to Scripture, and they will try to elevate themselves that way. And what this served to prevent the poor from banding together and overthrowing those who were oppressing them. This is how Marx thought of religion, that it was kind of like a drug. If you have had, well, I'll just use my own example, having had, a very, very tough life. When I was younger, I took to drinking and drinking in a kind of raucous way, this kind of binge drinking, kind of fighting, kind of very rednecky way of being, right? If I can say that, I'm talking about myself. But a lot of that was because I was kind of masking, coming to grips with some things that I had experienced in my life. While it's alcohol, it's still an opiate in the sense, in the general sense that it's a drug, right? It's a drug that is used to mask pain, and of course, this is how Marx viewed religion, not as something that gave meaning to life and gave people hope, as something that was kind of a false hope, a panacea. Uh, Marx also believed in something called economic determinism, and this is the idea that economics determines culture rather than the other way around, right? So, instead of our laws, our attitudes, our religious beliefs, instead of those shaping our financial success or failure, it's our financial success or failure that shapes our laws, our culture, our religious beliefs. So what we want to look at is economics. That's what determines everything about a culture. Marx argued that history is driven by something called the mode of production. And we call this dialectical materialism. Don't worry about that term. The mode of production is basically what determines what a society will look like, whatever the mode of production is. And that will make more sense in a moment. Mode of production has two parts: the means of production, the labor, tools, and knowledge used to produce goods, and the relations of production, the class relations, laws regulating property, etc. So you combine those two, the relations of production and the means of production, and you get the mode of production. And there have been several modes of production throughout history that all societies will go through. Again, according to Marx, he's invoking science, right? This is social science in the classic sense. All societies are going to go through these different stages of the mode of production changing. Marx used history to make his point. Marx argued that the first stage of human development, the first mode of production, was primitive communism. And again, this is something that will be very familiar to some people, particularly if they are familiar with some of the ideas that were made popular in the 1960s and 70s. This is the idea that hunter-gatherers shared goods and made decisions communally, right? You have a lot of anthropology professors in the 1960s and 70s arguing that, well, Western culture, the United States, it's an industrial way of life, it's a capitalist way of life, people are not sharing, people are oppressing each other in this kind of economic great chain of being, right? But in pre-industrial societies, hunter-gatherer societies, people shared goods, they made decisions communally. And of course, this is there to a certain extent that's true, but what these anthropologists were dishonest about was that in hunter-gatherer societies, you don't have the kind of large-scale society that we have. You have very small groups of people who are related to one another, who treat each other as relatives, basically. The society isn't complex enough and large-scale enough economically um, to support large numbers of people who were not related, living communally. So that's in a sense an advantage they had, but only very very small numbers of people could be supported by this way of life. It took a great amount of space. It took a great amount of resources to satisfy a very small band of people. So people are living with their uncles and their great grandfather who controls the family unit, kind of like the Maasai with the Liban, and they move around from territory to territory, even though the Maasai are pastoralists, not hunter-gatherer. But there was this idea that was the true state of humanity, and that industrialization and evolving these very complex state-level societies, that it was somehow a mistake. Of course, many of these anthropologists were dishonest in that they uh, they didn't mention in many of these works that around 30% of men in hunter-gatherer societies die by violence in the pre-modern era. That these hunter-gatherer groups they have many inefficiencies, and that there are many problems, medical problems, sometimes even issues with starvation that we don't face in our post-industrial lives. But also, this is based on, again, Rousseau. Rousseau argued that people that man in his natural state was essentially good, essentially moral. Well, these are human beings without a state-level society. They don't have any written laws. They don't have any statutes put down on the books. The law is customary in the sense that it's word of mouth. It's shared generation to generation orally. And the, because of this bias inherited from those who kind of took Rousseau out of context and to extremes, many of these anthropologists in the 1960s and 70s also began to argue that warfare is a Western, modern invention, that warfare didn't exist. And there's a perfect example. There's a song by Neil Young called Cortez the Killer, in which he describes the Aztecs as these peaceful people who had never known warfare. Then suddenly Cortez shows up, and all these people are killed. And of course, we know from that we looked at the Aztecs, nothing could be further than the truth. Just like the Spanish and Portuguese, the Aztecs were a militaristic empire based on expansion through warfare, and had a religion that called for military expansionism. And that points out there was a tendency in the 1960s, 60s, and 70s to portray people living in hunter-gatherer societies or horticulturist or pastoralist societies as inherently noble without violence. And of course, we know from the Maasai that's a great society of warriors. And of course, that always irked me because if you look at the other lecture that I'm going to post tonight, you see pictures of me with my family. That there's my dad is part Choctaw, and there's a very heavy warlike strain in Choctaw culture. I mean, many of these Choctaw men were great warriors, great generals, great fighters, and growing up hearing about some of these generals, how in particularly in the American Civil War, how many of them had been courted by both sides in an attempt to try to gain the allegiance of the different groups, because they were so skilled at particular modes of warfare. And it surprises me, and it's kind kind of humorous to me, this idea that warfare is something that was imported from the old world into the new. That nothing could be further from the truth. There are archaeological, particularly one in South Dakota, that is still being studied, in which several thousand men, women, and children were brutally massacred as part of what's now posited as a possible invasion of that region of one group to another. But there is. I also mentioned in the video list the Choctaw Stickball game. I would like for people to take a look at this game, because this game is something that was used as a means to avoid war. It wasn't always successful in avoiding war. Warfare still broke out, but because it was used as an attempt to avoid war, to try to as a last-ditch attempt to stop conflict, the game itself is very brutal. And there's been some controversy about whether or not this game, should be played. Of course, I think that it should. I think most people in Mississippi, Choctaw or non-Choctaw, think that it should continue being centuries-old tradition. But it's a very violent game. It's more violent than American football. It's more violent than rugby. It's more violent than really any sport outside of outright, MMA or something. But take a look at that, and because that is an example of how aggression, masculinity, militarism, these can exist in any society, any human society. And this is something that in the 60s and 70s, many anthropology professors attempted to deny. And the reason I keep bringing this up is they denied this because they believed in this idea of primitive communism, this idea that was started by Marx. They believed in this idea that there was a point in time where human beings were pristine and perfect, and this is to me, I see this as kind of a warped Garden of Eden, kind of a bizarro world interpretation of human beings being perfect at one time before the fall. The fall being when we discovered agriculture, and found it much easier to feed ourselves and not starve to death. But that's neither here nor there. That's applying rational thought to people in the 1960s and 70s who were mostly not rational. But that's my bias. That's another discussion for another day. So under this mode of production, you have hunting and gathering, and the social relationships reflected that. You had groups of men as hunters, groups of women as foragers and gatherers, and their relationships with one another were determined by this economic model. The hunters had to take care of one another. You had one chief hunter. If you think Rakita in the one video of the Maasai men taking meat from lions, he's kind of the chief hunter. He's their eldest relative, and he's got expertise, and he's kind of the natural leader there. There isn't the rule of law. There isn't the kind of inequality that we see today. And of course, it's because these people are living in family units, and a fact conveniently glossed over by many who came after Marx. And of course, I don't want to get the impression that I have anything but admiration for many of these societies. Particularly, we talk about the Choctaw, we talked about the Maasai. These societies, to me, have a lot of positive attributes that are very noble. But the ones that I tend to find noble are the ones that, particularly the fact that these men are very brave, very self-reliant, take care of the people in their communities. These are the very ideas that were actually downplayed in the 1960s and 70s by many Marxist academics. So agriculture was discovered at some point. Now they think that in what's now Iran, some women had been foraging, and they had begun to notice, moving from area to area, that where they had foraged, that different grasses that they had foraged actually grew up in the paths they had used to get from their forage site to their camp. So they had begun to notice that as they were dropping seeds, where these seeds grew, these plants emerged, and that they could actually control this process.
So over time, in the Fertile Crescent, in ancient Egypt, in the Nile River Delta, in the Yellow River Delta in China, the Indus River in India, etc., you start to see agricultural societies spring up. One where human beings are, instead of hunting and gathering, at first they're doing a little bit of all of it. They're doing a little bit of hunting and gathering. They're doing a little bit of growing their own crops. Over time, human beings start to uh, grow crops intensively, growing lots of grains like wheat, rye, barley, etc. And this allowed human society to exist on a much larger scale than it had previously. The amount of calories produced by one laborer skyrocketed. It was exponential growth. Suddenly, the labor of one person could feed 45 people, right? Whereas a hunter-gatherer, it might take 6 or 7 men to take down a wildebeest, right? Or and if we're talking about prehistoric North America, a mammoth. Right? So, the efficiency in terms of food production increased exponentially. But a lot of this work was very tedious, it was very monotonous, it was very backbreaking, particularly in those societies where to produce something out of the land, you had to have an irrigation system, like Egypt, like what's now Iraq and Iran, Mesopotamia, Persia, China. And to do that, to get people to work on these irrigation projects and do some of this backbreaking labor, you had to have some form of coercion. And thus we have the emergence of despotism. This is a kind of political system in which power is concentrated in the hands of a very powerful individual, in which the great mass of people have very little agency. We might call this Iron Age civilization. For Marx, it was called slave society. This is, if you're familiar with the biblical story of the Hebrews in Egypt building the pyramids as slaves for the pharaohs, this is the perfect example of slave society. Even though in reality, now looking back, historically, some archaeologists have argued that that there are some differences in the archaeological record. That's neither here nor there. But this is what we call a slave mode of production. You have all these farmers who are coerced by these god kings, whether that's the king of Babylon or the pharaoh in Egypt or the emperor of China, kind of whipping people and forcing them to build these great monuments and grow their crops with very little agency. And of course we know that this is kind of a caricature of how society really existed, and but then again, this is Marx's own personal 19th century view, kind of coming out in his work. The slave mode of production was overthrown by what we call the feudal mode of production. Remember, these modes of production are what determine how societies are structured. The feudal mode of production is one in which ownership of the means of production, how we produce goods, is distributed out to people in exchange for military service. Okay, so the power of the despot is lessened, but by giving out land to different servants who promise to serve him militarily, the monarch actually becomes much more effective. Government becomes more efficient. So these great lords and France in the old regime, the kings of France, they are the quintessential feudal leaders in Marx's mind. You have the kings, they give out land to the dukes, who give out land to the counts, who give out lands to various other, to barons, and then the barons give out land to knights, and on so down, and on so down. And these members of the aristocracy have to provide a certain number of troops for their overlords in the event of war. So if I'm the king and then I have 8 dukes, I'll split my kingdom up and I'll give those 8 dukes a certain amount of land, and I'll say, provide me with X amount of bowmen and swordsmen and horsemen when I call you up. And then they would do the same thing with the counts beneath them, the barons beneath them, the knights beneath them. So you have this kind of military aristocracy, the knights of Europe, again, just like the samurai in Japan. They're very, very similar in many ways, despite being very different civilizations on the other side of the world. There's still some similarities there. The bottom class of people were serfs. This is the third estate, the serfs. These are laborers who are not, they're bound to the land, meaning that they can't move. They have to do what they've been doing in their family for the last 200 years. They're bound to the land, but they're not chattel. They're not, they have some agency relative to those who are in a form of chattel slavery. In other words, a serf had to work the land for his lord. He had to work this land to provide him with some of the proceeds. At the same time, that serf had a right to exist on that land for his entire life. Okay, so his children couldn't be sold away from him. He couldn't be moved around. He couldn't be forced to do something else. So while on the one hand, if you were the son of a serf, you couldn't leave that village and go do something else, but at the same time, you couldn't be kicked out of that village either. So again, it's a system of exploitation, but it's one in which the serf did enjoy at least a small amount of agency. Revolutions arose, the Enlightenment happened, and feudalism was overthrown. The overthrowers of feudalism in the French Revolution, the American Revolution, were seen by Marx as ushering in the contemporary mode of production, the new mode of production, in which you would have those prosperous members of the Third Estate controlling society, and Marx called them the bourgeoisie, the class of bankers, industrialists, merchants, who possessed the capital, the funds that were necessary to invest in industry, to invest in all these different products. At the time, they were referred to as the middle class, and we're talking about Europe here. In Britain, this term middle class can also be used for these people. It's not the way we use the term generally in the United States. What we would call middle class in the United States would probably be called more working class in, or possibly lower middle class, but most likely working class in Europe. At the bottom, you have the proletariat. This is the class that did not own the means of production. They didn't own any of the machines, any of the factories, any of the tools. And thus they had to subsist by selling their labor. That's all they have to sell is their labor. And so, because they have to sell their labor, they're vulnerable relative to the bourgeoisie, right? Who can exploit them. And this is a picture of these child miners in Wales. This is a good example of how Marx saw the essence of capitalism, right? In this form of very tough, very intense labor. And I use this picture here just because I was watching this video the other day, and it kind of came to me that in this video, okay, this video is it's R. Kelly's song "Download," if you're familiar with that song. In this video, and of course, none of these people are remotely anywhere, communists. But all of these people are extremely wealthy celebrities. But the portrayal of the wealthy, even though in this R. Kelly is portraying kind of gangsters, but kind of mafia type, sort of mafia, sort of kind of robber barons, kind of industrialist type. Ron Isley kind of plays this kind of fat cat millionaire, and R. Kelly is one of his bodyguards, one of his kind of go-to men. But the portrayal of the wealthy in that video is just so on to how the wealthy are portrayed in so many pieces of communist propaganda. And of course, in this video, the lifestyle is kind of glorified. The opulence is kind of glorified. You can see the Haitian supermodel Garcelle Beauvais is in it, getting into this car with R. Kelly, and of course Ronald Isley, who's Mr. Viggs in the video. He's kind of ruthless. He has a great amount of assets, and he's kind of a no holds barred uh, kind of robber baron who will go to any length to ensure that his best interests are being served. And of course, in this video, you can see the this is the famous scene where Ron Isley has after R. Kelly has been severely beaten, he leaves him out in the desert and he says, "I did this to you," and then drives off. But that is how Marx saw the wealthy in society in this very kind of over the top, very dramatic fashion, right? This that Mr. Big, Mr. Biggs, he is the quintessential capitalist in the mind of Marx and those immediately coming afterwards. So I thought that was a good way to present that, just having thought about that while watching this video. But again, Mr. Biggs has a relationship with Garcelle Bouvet's character. Her name is Lila Hart. So he has a relationship with her, and then he, if you haven't seen the video, he pays R. Kelly to kind of watch over her while he goes on a trip. It's kind of similar, I guess. I think it's Pulp Fiction, though I've only seen parts of that. And then, of course, you know what happens. R. Kelly, being this kind of young, tough guy, Garcelle Bouvet falls in love with him. They fall in love, and they end up having a relationship. And Mr. Biggs finds out about their infidelity and ends up having R. Kelly beaten and dumped in the desert. And of course, she ends up getting beaten as well. And the last scene is of them together in the hospital. That's just a good example of how capitalism is kind of portrayed in the minds of many of these 19th century Marxists, right? That you have these kind of wealthy robber barons. They're kind of controlling people with their wealth. They're controlling women with their wealth. They're controlling and abusing men with their wealth. And again, that's a caricature. It's not something that really is reflective of reality. It's something that's done for entertainment. Marx argued that the proletariat has nothing to offer the capitalists except labor. The workers don't own anything. They have to offer their labor to band together and benefit economically. So labor is a commodity. You can sell labor. You can determine the price of your labor. And in fact, you do. You say, well, I will work for this salary. I won't work for that salary. And like industrialists, Marx argued that laborers had a right to assemble, they had a right to unite and dictate the price of their labor. You can see that in this image of all of these farm workers and factory workers banding together to produce this giant fist. If all the members of the proletariat banded together and they formed labor unions and they formed one giant labor union that could actually overthrow the state, they would usher in a new mode of production, according to Marx. It was called the communist mode of production. And you can see that in this this piece of Soviet propaganda here. There's the Soviet worker kind of pushing aside the rifle given to him by this American industrialist, Mr. Biggs, again. And he's offering him these kind of consumer goods, these commodities here. And he's saying, no, I don't want any of this. I want to control my own destiny as a worker, as a proud worker, right, in a socialist utopia. And of course, at the very same time that this kind of propaganda was being produced in the 1930s, millions of people were being deliberately starved to death by the leader of the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin, in these massive purges. But that's obviously not going to be what shows up on the propaganda. When the proletariat overthrows the bourgeoisie, I went too far. All right, anyway, we'll just continue with that so I don't have to go back and do that again, and the slideshow will be there if you missed that text. But when the proletariat overthrows the bourgeoisie, they're supposed to usher in this utopia where through the state, the proletariat controls all of the production, the means of production, and therefore everyone can share equally, according to Marx, to take what you need and produce according to your ability. That was how Marx saw human nature. Again, remember, he saw human beings as fundamentally good. We can take what we need, leave what we don't need, and then produce to the best of our ability. We will work for the betterment of our fellow human beings. That's how Marx believed human beings were. And of course, that didn't happen. In many of these societies, these very brutal totalitarian states emerged in the 20th century. We're about to talk about one in a moment. We saw Marx's ideology used to perpetrate some of the most grotesque crimes in the history of the world. What ended up happening is that when these workers banded together to overthrow their traditional forms of government, they gave all of the power to the state so that people would share in the means of production. But instead of everyone sharing equally in the means of production, basically no one shared in the means of production, and the state took all the power for itself, took on a mind of its own. Those in power, those in the Communist Party, ruling society as elites in the same way the elites that had been overthrown before had done so, except this time the average person doesn't have the private property or the independent agency to protect his or herself from the state. And a good example of that is in the Holodomor in the Ukraine, when the communist dictator Joseph Stalin, because many people in the Ukraine were opposed to his rule, and he controlled the agricultural system. Remember, this is centralized control. The state controls the means of production. He deliberately starved millions of people to death. And it's the same kind of situation in North Korea in the 1990s. In the northeastern region of North Korea, near the Chinese border, many people were hostile to the regime. They were not loyal. They wanted a more moderate form of communism. And so those people found themselves in concentration camps being deliberately starved to death by the state that had all power over them. All right, we're going to take a look at communism in Asia. And this is to demonstrate how different communism, when we use the term communism, well, when I've been using the term so far, I've been describing 19th century and 20th century communism growing out of the thought of Karl Marx. So we're very much looking at the kind of East European communism of the Soviet Union that peaked around the 1960s, 1970s. We're not looking at the cultural Marxism that is prevalent among some today, even though that's very different in many ways. And another element we haven't discussed is kind of East Asian communism. East Asian communism is very different. In fact, in many ways, it's not communism at all. Though it was dressed up as communism in the 1930s and 40s, much of that was done so that the early East Asian quote-unquote communists, who basically wanted independence for their own nations and to govern their own nations, would call themselves communists to obtain assistance from the Soviet Union in World War II. And this is a good example. North Korea. In North Korea, the founder of North Korea, Kim Il-sung, he was an anti-Japanese guerrilla. When we talk about World War II, we'll learn how the Japanese had occupied Korea, had brutalized it for multiple decades, and there were many Koreans who were resentful of Japanese rule, but who were kind of cowed into submission. And Kim Il-sung comes along, and he wants to drive the Japanese out, and he turns to the Soviet Union for assistance. So he begins to become this communist, even though the state he created became, in reality, anything but communist, even though it was communist in name. Now, certainly, there are some similarities in that the government had all of the power, the state had all of the resources, but There was no workers' paradise. In fact, he ended up taking kind of the mantle of not just a dictator, but kind of as a god king, one who's literally worshipped by his people. And of course, this system has undergone some serious shocks, and millions of people have been killed, have starved to death, have been forcibly starved to death by the state, which is the communist, historically speaking, the communist's biggest tool to crush dissent. Many people have been shot in concentration camps, and you can take a look at some of the videos I've put up to see both how Kim Il-sung became this kind of godlike figure, almost a religious figure. Well, not even almost, literally a religious figure to his people, and some of the deprivations suffered in this kind of regime. Because again, when you give up your right to private property, this is the coming out of John Locke and Thomas Jefferson. This is their interpretation, right? You give up your right to private property, you actually give up your right to agency, right? Because it's private property. If you don't have private property, your resistance to the state becomes much, much, much more difficult. All right, we're looking at some images, North Korean images. These are propaganda images of, these are supposed to be U.S. troops brutalizing civilians in the Korean War. You have this guy here being lynched, giving this rousing communist speech to all of these terrified civilians. Later you see U.S. troops pushing Korean people into a mass grave, women and children. And of course, you know, this is meant to incite hatred of the United States. And of course, it's historically inaccurate. There were many civilians killed in North and South Korea during the Korean War of the 1950s, but the vast majority of those were killed by bombing. Either the Soviet-built planes of the North Korean Air Force bombing, or artillery shells striking civilian targets, or the U.S. Air Force bombing targets in North Korea. Civilians were killed in the Korean War. About 5 million people died total in the Korean War, but most of that was due to aerial or artillery attacks, not these kinds of close and personal. These kinds of events went out with the camera. Once an event called the Rape of Nanking in World War II, the Japanese literally doing these kinds of events on camera, pictures being shown. That had an effect on stopping this kind of behavior worldwide. So these are really these are meant to kind of brainwash the young North Korean citizen into despising the United States. And again, you know, these are very disturbing in many ways, but you can see how, you know, this is one image of a U.S. soldier taking a baby away from some Korean women. You know, why they would do this? What you know, if you've ever served in the Army, you know, there's not exactly a course on taking away infants from women, but you know, this is a society where the state controls the media, where you can't exactly criticize the dominant narrative. So you know, this is what people are forced to accept, and eventually they do accept it, growing up in this system. And of course, you see again another image of a mass grave. And of course, in this video, you can see this is the famous scene where Ron Isley has after R. Kelly has been severely beaten, he leaves him out in the desert, and he says, "I did this to you," and then drives off. But that is how Marx saw the wealthy in society, in this very kind of over-the-top, very dramatic fashion, right? This that Mr. Biggs, he is the quintessential capitalist in the mind of Marx and those immediately coming afterwards. So I thought that was a good way to present that, just having thought about that while watching this video. But again, Mr. Biggs has a relationship with Garcelle Bouvet's character. Her name is Lila Hart. So he has a relationship with her, and then if you haven't seen the video, he pays R. Kelly to kind of watch over her while he goes on a trip. It's kind of similar, I guess. I think it's Pulp Fiction, though I've only seen parts of that. But and then, of course, you know what happens. R. Kelly, being this kind of young, young, tough guy, you know, Garcelle Beauvais falls in love with him. They fall in love, and they end up having a relationship. And Mr. Biggs finds out about their infidelity and ends up having R. Kelly beaten and dumped in the desert. And of course, she ends up getting beaten as well. And I'll just show you again some. These are some pamphlets that would be dropped to U.S. troops during the Korean War. They would be shot out of artillery shells. So instead of an artillery round coming down and exploding, one would explode in the air, and then all of these pamphlets would come flying down. And you know, they were effective in certain instances. The communists in North Korea had enough understanding of American psychology to make some very effective propaganda to demoralize some. Again, showing my own bias here, like most Americans of the 20th century, and this is something that was generally the case in American history. If you look back at history, most Americans, really up until the 1990s, with the onset of globalization, the vast majority of Americans were opposed to foreign military commitments. Even in the Cold War, the government had to enlist the aid of mass media to keep Americans from drifting towards isolationism, which, while I wouldn't call myself an isolationist, you know, I sympathize with those people in the 1950s who didn't want to be involved in these conflicts. Having been all over the world, I've come to the conclusion, and this is my own opinion, you know, it's my own bias, but it's important that you know my bias so that you can kind of, you know, understand where I'm coming from with this lecture. You know, when I look at the United States, I see a lot of problems, but I see a society that is healthy in ways that many other societies are not. But I also have seen people in other societies who want to live the way that they live, right? Who don't want to have, even though from my perspective, there, in some instances, some cultures are somewhat dysfunctional. Some attributes of some practices of some cultures, rather, that's my view, right? And those people may not want to change. And from my perspective, it's a waste of money, of lives, of resources, and of our own kind of political will to attempt to change people who don't want to be changed. And really, I think that we're blessed with this, you know, gigantic nation surrounded by these oceans, all these resources, and it's so wealthy that we should use all of that funding, you know, that goes to these military ventures to protect and prosper as our ancestors did in the first half of the 20th century. But then again, you know, that's a discussion for another day, or maybe even the discussion board. But you know, my whole, you know, close the borders and let's, you know, close the curtains and enjoy being American citizens. That's not, you know, that's not popular with a lot of people. But that pamphlet there on the right, it is an attempt to play on the thought of someone like me, right? Why are you here, 5,000 miles from your homes, risking your lives, killing men, Korean men and women, and even infants who never harmed America, thought of attacking you? Why? Ask yourselves and keep asking till you get the answer. Why? And that's an attempt to kind of demoralize the average, you know, American infantryman who hadn't really heard of Korea until he had been drafted and sent to war there. But at the same time, even though that was playing on kind of Americans' desire to kind of mind their own business and be concerned with their own local affairs, the North Korean society, the North Korean Communist Society, over the decades, now we see that that North Korea was stopped in its invasion of South Korea, that South Korea has become the 11th wealthiest nation on earth. It's the home of Samsung. It's the home of Kia. So, you know, South Korea is a very prosperous, democratic, technologically advanced society. And when we look at North Korean imagery, particularly the state propaganda, which is the vast majority of imagery produced in North Korea, it has kind of a sort of basket case quality. You can see this picture of Kim Jong-il on horseback, like he's this knight, even though he was overweight. He wasn't morbidly obese, and he passed away a few years ago. You can see him here with his father, Kim Il-sung, and they're surrounded by all of these Korean children. These two men are regarded as kind of the founders of the state, and regarded as much more than George Washington. The man seated here, Kim Il-sung, in the 1930s, when he was a young man, he resisted the Japanese when very few Korean people were willing to face that kind of, to take those kinds of risks. So he's seen as this great hero, but due to the propaganda machine, he's almost elevated to the status of a god. In fact, I'm going to show you in one of the videos, there's a clip of his funeral, and you can see just how intense it was. And while we have a tendency to say, well, it's fake, people were forced to do that, and no doubt probably thousands of people were forced or felt compelled to engage in that kind of mourning, even when they didn't identify with that. At the same time, some people did die from depression and after that, because they had been so brainwashed into this system. So you can imagine if you're raised on this kind of propaganda, right, and you have all these problems. The problems are due to you living under kind of a basket case government with a semi-communist, sort of nationalist, hyper-nationalist mentality. You know, you're going to blame an outside enemy for your problems. And so as people began to starve in the 1990s and up to the present moment, the propaganda has become even more extreme. It's less focused on the atrocities from the Korean War, and focused more on just almost a kind of an abstract, quasi-religious hatred of the United States and South Korea. And the ethnic element has increased in its proportion, right? You can see these, and if you go to Eastern Asia, there are a couple of commercials I wanted to put on, but I didn't know if it would offend people too much to see. Yeah, because it's very shocking. If anyone had put these commercials on in the United States, those people would have been fired. That company would have been ruined. Because we have a culture, you know, we complain about political correctness at times. Many people do from many different, you know, perspectives. But the idea that, you know, we're not allowed to culturally to demean each other. When you're in a society where that doesn't exist, it can be very shocking. This is a picture of Korean children fighting off a U.S. soldier here and a Japanese soldier here, and you can again see the kind of ethnic representations. For the U.S. soldier, the giant hook nose and yellow hair. Again, that's a standard representation of a U.S. soldier, a Caucasian U.S. soldier, a U.S. soldier of African American heritage. There's a stereotype in North Korean propaganda for that as well. And you know, you can see that this very much has an ethnic element to it. One of you know, these are civilizational enemies.
Okay, so today's video we're going to be talking about communism. We're going to be talking about communism as an historical movement in the late 19th century as a reaction to philosophy. We're going to look at what the most prominent person in communism, the founder of Marxist philosophy, Karl Marx, what he, I wouldn't say founder, in that he was building on people who came before him, but kind of the quintessential thinker of the perspective, how he viewed history and why he thought the way he did. So I'd like for you to take a minute, and also I should mention that the videos are in the description box. I will not be referencing them throughout this video. They're kind of meant to be watched either before or after the video. So take a look at those, but I won't be referencing them as I discuss. In the 19th century, if you look back at some of the pictures on industrialization, you'll see pictures of children working at spinning jennies, other devices, these giant looms.
All right, the last thing I'll point out is ice bucket challenge. It's been going around, and I've been thinking about Korea as I do this lecture, and that is, you know, if you've served in Korea, you know some of these guys. If you've been to Korea, maybe you've met some of these guys. This is a picture of some South Korean, Republic of Korea or ROC Korea Marines training, and these South Korean Marines are some of the toughest soldiers. So, I mean, I'm not saying that they're necessarily tougher than U.S. soldiers, but having been a U.S. infantryman, having known some South Korean Marines, they're definitely among allied nations. They seem to be the ones that I think are very respectable in the sense that their training is extremely grueling, and it involves, their training is very traditional. You have to keep in mind that their country is constantly being brought to the verge of war, right? And not just the kind of wars that we're in the United States. We tend to fight where they're halfway around the world, and we're not as personally invested in them. In South Korea, the threat of nuclear attack is something that's in the back of many people's minds. So South Korea has compulsory 21-month military service obligation for young men, and that's basically a draft. So every young man in South Korea has to serve for a 21-month period, and those who go into the Marines of the Republic of Korea are generally those who are physically and mentally, much more. They have a high level of endurance, high level of commitment to defending the nation, and this is part of the training. And while they're smiling and it seems like they're having fun, one of the key difficulties in waging war in Korea is that it's very mountainous and it's very cold. In the 1950s, it was a struggle for many U.S. troops to avoid freezing to death. Well, the Republic of Korea Marines engage in training exercises where they have to immerse themselves in snow with no BDU top on. They have to get in ice cold water that if you stay too long in it, you can freeze to death. And this is designed to break them of aversion to cold. And it's very effective. Many of these, the U.S. government has studied, these techniques and how these Korean Marines can operate in this kind of cold weather. Of course, many of their training methods are no longer acceptable, would not be acceptable in the United States military, such as NCOs striking soldiers, slapping them, kicking them, etc. And also they have, again, how each culture views military service views it differently. Taekwondo is a Korean art. Taekwondo is huge in both South and North Korea. It's kind of like how, if you're in high school in the United States, you're athletic, you're going to play baseball or football. In South Korea, you're gonna do you might do baseball, but Taekwondo is the that's the captain of the football team, right? The one of the members of the Taekwondo club or team. So Taekwondo is big in the Army, and so these soldiers, if there's a dispute, they'll have matches in which there'll be multiple soldiers on each side, kind of duking it out with very powerful kicks that can break a bone, and it's just really interesting to see some of it's just to see another country's kind of military culture, and this kind of intensity, the intense training, the intense the compulsory military service. This is due to the fact that this country is in danger in a way that many other countries aren't. Another example of that is Israel. In Israel, you have a draft not just for males but for females also, and this is due to the fact that it's surrounded by hostile adversaries in many people's minds and in reality. So, it's something to think about. And these soldiers are very effective. South Korea has generally, because of its vulnerable position, has generally supported the U.S. in most of the U.S.'s wars, certainly in the Vietnam War. In the Vietnam War, the South Koreans sent large numbers of these South Korean Marines, and I think, I don't remember the statistic, but the South Korean Marines proportionally killed more Vietnamese communists than any other any other country's military. There were also problems that in the late 1960s, early 1970s, these South Korean Marines, they had experienced their fathers and older brothers being killed in the First Korean War in the 1950s, and their cities being invaded and occupied, and a lot of destruction. So when though they were very effective in battle, there was a problem in that a large number of the atrocities that were attributed to U.S. soldiers in Vietnam by the American media, some of them were actually committed by South Korean forces, because the South Koreans, there was a problem in keeping them under control, because they had no qualms about executing an entire village of communists, because there was this they themselves had that happen to their own communities during the communist invasion of the 1950s. In fact, there was a famous photograph in which there's the barrel of an M16 up against the head of an elderly Vietnamese woman, and it was circulated in the American media. And again, the M16 has a very distinguished, the barrel's very distinguishable, and of course that's the American firearm at the time, and it's kind of symbolic, the same way the AK-47 is symbolic of the Soviet Union. But it showed this barrel and this woman's head, and of course it was a disingenuous photograph. If the original photograph that the photographer took, it was the woman was actually being interrogated by some South Korean soldiers, again, who growing up under the threat of communism in a way that many people never have, had a very hardened opinion of it, and many atrocities were committed. But at the same time, these are this nation has, regarding your point of view, whatever your point of view is, this is a very effective fighting force that has managed to deter another war in Korea, and has allied itself very closely with the United States and its interests around the world. And of course, to me, again, maybe this is my bias, but I don't think this is so much of a bias. When I look at South Korea, I look at a very prosperous society where there are problems, like there are in any society, but a society that is wealthy and generally peaceful, that is functional. And of course, you look at North Korea, anything having to do with North Korea, it seems like more and more of it is just that it's a basket case. But digress. And this is a final slide. This is a little bit of a joke here, right? This is an image of Google Earth. You can see how in Google Earth you have all of the light reflected in the atmosphere from all of these different cities, and you can see obviously only the capital city of Pyongyang in North Korea actually has a large amount of sustainable electrical power. I don't know, I just thought that was kind of interesting. They say that you can drive a car throughout the major highways of North Korea, and you can go hours without seeing another car, because the economy has broken down and people can't afford cars. But, you know, watch these videos that I've included with this and participate in the discussion board. And thanks.